March 14th, 2023, about 30 miles west in East Texas of Tyler, where the landscape used to be studded with oil dirks like a mechanical forest, where empires and fortunes were formed by black gold, where agricultural farmland was transformed into industrial powerhouses during the 1920s boom. For almost 50 years, the Anderson Refinery complex has been neglected. Once a flourishing industrial plant that processed thousands of barrels of crude oil every day now loomed as a rusted reminder of the past. The main refinery building was constructed in 1925 and is a three-story brick construction, towered over the land. Storage tanks, smaller constructions, and it was surrounded by the skeletal remains of processing machinery. Weeds spread through fractured concrete. Windows were either completely absent or damaged. The area was fenced off, marked with no signs prohibiting trespassing, gradually deteriorating while the contemporary world moved past it. The Lottie property was acquired in March 2023 by one business that specializes in industrial sites is Lanier Development Corporation. Rehabilitation and rebuilding. They intended to dismantle the shuttered refinery complex and tidy up any leftover contamination of the environment and redevelop the area for business purposes. The area included about 40 acres. Despite its industrial nature, the site was valued in an area that had experienced substantial growth in recent decades. The past. Prior to the start of demolition, structural engineers, and environmental, the property needed to be thoroughly surveyed by experts. March 14th, a team headed by Robert Martinez, a structural engineer with 25 years of industrial demolition experience, arrived to perform a thorough evaluation of the main refinery structure. As could be expected after decades of disuse, the building's exterior was in bad shape. However, it was the inside that turned out to be most fascinating. Robert and his group compared the physical construction while inspecting the basement level. They observed a difference in the 1925 architectural designs. A sizable open basement area for utilities and storage was depicted in the drawings. However, the actual area was smaller than what the design showed. The basement seemed to be missing 20 feet. Robert looked around the basement walls with caution. The brickwork on the eastern wall was distinct from the remainder of the basement. The mortar was a slightly distinct hue. There was a discrepancy in the brick pattern. Someone had constructed a wall across a portion of the basement to block off a portion of the original area. Why was the question? Robert informed his assistant, Jennifer Hayes, that this wall was not a part of the original building. While they looked at the sealed area, later, most likely in their 20s or 30s, someone bricked this off depending on the materials and mortar style. What's causing it? Typical demolition. The process would be to record the anomaly and carry out the demolition. However, Robert suggested opening the sealed area prior to demolition because of his meticulousness and professional curiosity. Should they have to be aware of any environmental risks or structural problems behind that wall before bringing the decreasing. Robert's crew meticulously removed enough bricks on March 15th to make a hole in the enclosed area. The restoration was meticulous, maintaining structural integrity while granting access. By late morning, they had produced a gap that is about 5 feet high and 3 feet broad. Robert flashed his torch via the aperture. The air felt heavy and stale, and the area beyond was completely dark. After being imprisoned for decades, the beam showed a space that was about 20 feet by 15 feet, with a ceiling that could be 7 feet high. The area seemed deserted, yet, for what appeared to be debris on the distant corner's floor. Robert cautiously entered the enclosed space and tested the floor and air quality prior to moving further. When he got closer to the corner, the exact nature of the debris was revealed by the flashlight beam. Human skeleton. Remains on the concrete floor, partially covered by faded fabric, as though the individual had fallen or been positioned there many years ago. Robert withdrew right away and made contact with the authorities. The Gregg County Sheriff's Department had secured the area by early afternoon. By the The state medical examiner's office and Texas Rangers forensic teams had shown up that evening. Throughout the following seal days, the remnants and the enclosed space would be thoroughly inspected and recorded. The skeleton was almost finished. Forensic examination revealed an male adult who was probably in his 50s when he passed away. Suggested outfit fragments, men's business clothes from the early 20th century. Among the remains were a number of objects that had endured in the confined area for 9 decades. A gold pocket watch. WJ's initials are etched on the casing, which is tarnished but undamaged. A signatory ring with a family name, crest, that is also made of gold. The severely degraded remnants show what seemed like a wallet made of leather. The leather nearly completely deteriorated, with tarnished metal clasps, but nothing else that could be identified. Following 94 years, historical scholars were summoned in right away. The initials WJ, visiting the site, prompted them to review documents from the Anderson Refinery, which had been constructed and run by the Anderson family from the 1920s to the 1970s. They discovered something amazing. William James Anderson's 1929 missing persons case. The owner and founder of the refinery had disappeared on September 21st of that year and never discovered. Weeks would pass throughout the identifying procedure. Dental records from 1929 were uncommon, yet the Anderson family had the income to acquire thorough medical records. Archive files from a dentist in Tyler contained historical dental records, who had worked for the Anderson family. Comparing the skeletal remains offered a likely match, but after 94 years' history, records by themselves were scarce. Results from DNA analysis were more conclusive. Living, there were William James Anderson's descendants, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. The identification was highly likely confirmed by genetic comparison. William James Anderson's remains were found. He had been missing for 94 years. Make sure to activate the notification bell and subscribe to this channel before we continue with this mystery. On September 21st, 1929, riches, power, and the competitive environment of the oil boom in Texas. At the conclusion, you'll comprehend how one of the most influential oilmen in East Texas perished in a walled basement beneath his own refinery, and the reason it took almost a century to locate him. The queries. The challenges investigators faced were eerie. William James Anderson was murdered by whom? Why was? Is he concealed within his own establishment? And what was the outcome of a murder in a major refinery? 94 years without being discovered? The age of William James Anderson was 52. In September 1929, when his riches and power were at their highest, he got up, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a sturdy physique that had grown thicker with riches over time, enabled him to assign physical tasks. His hair had become gray instead of brown, even though he kept it well-groomed. He wore outfits made to order in Dallas on a 1928 Cadillac and resided in a Tyler estate that was regarded as one of East Texas's best residences. People who knew him were drawn to him because of his commanding presence, characterized him as a powerful man who controlled every space he went into. William was the son of a humble farmer who was born in rural East Texas in 1877, battled to earn a life from subpar soil. Growing up, William witnessed his father's hardship firsthand, labor himself to death while attempting to cultivate land that hardly yielded enough to provide food for the household. In 1892, William's father passed away. William, then 15, promised he would leave the family with nothing but debt, never again be in poverty. Although he had little formal education, William was bright and aspirational. He moved away from home at the age of 16 to work in the oil fields that were starting to take shape in East Texas. In the late 1890s, the start of William set himself up to benefit from the oil boom in Texas. He began as a roughneck, performing hazardous physical work on drilling rigs. He discovered all component of the industry's business, processing, and extraction of oil. William, then 23 years old, had saved enough cash by 1900 to buy a minor stake within an oil well. William's share of the well's oil was little, but Important. Every penny was reinvested, and he bought stakes in more wells. Drilling equipment, progressively accumulating funds. He had his own drilling business by 1910. Operation. He earned his first $1 million by 1915. In 1902, William had wed Catherine Hayes, a Tyler merchant's daughter. There, both families benefited from marriage. William became respected in society and made ties with East Texas's long-standing corporate community. Although Catherine's family became connected to the growing oil fortune, they had 3 children, a daughter named Elizabeth born in 1905 and a son named James born in 1903, and another son, Thomas, who was born in 1908. William's most notable accomplishment was the 20s. During that decade, the oil boom in East Texas burst with enormous. The discovery of new fields and the surge in oil prices led to immediate fortunes. With his wealth and years of knowledge, William was ideally situated to profit. He bought land in 1924 and constructed the Anderson Refinery is a plant that turns crude oil into gasoline, petroleum products, including kerosene. The refinery in Anderson turned into one of the significant activities in East Texas. It employed more than 200 people by 1929, produced thousands of barrels every day, and made huge profits. Williams' wealth increased to an estimated $8 million, or more than $120 million in today's money. He possessed holdings in numerous oil wells, controlled the refinery, and Tyler and other Texas communities' commercial buildings, as well as interests in banks and other companies. However, Williams' success was accompanied with adversaries. The oil. In the 1920s, industry was ruthless and frequently violent. Conflicts about drilling rights, claims jumping allegations, disputes over pipeline access, and business rivalry could become lethal due to battle for refinery contracts. William had a reputation for being brutal in business transactions. He made tough deals, used advantages without showing compassion, and had no regard for the people he outwitted. Although many feared his power and admired his success, many also had animosity toward him. By 1929, Williams' commercial transactions had developed into more intricate and, several muttered, increasingly questionable. He was embroiled in oil lease conflicts. Pipeline access caused him to clash with rivals. Work. Organizers were starting to focus on his refinery, calling for improved pay and working conditions for workers. Moreover, there were persistent but unverified rumors that William was involved in actions that violated the law, such as utilizing violence, altering contracts, bribing officials, or threats directed against rivals. The fall of 1929 was a pivotal period in American history, even though it was still poorly understood. The market for stocks had been reaching previously unheard of heights throughout the course of a decade, but fissures were starting to appear. September of 1929. A few investors were becoming anxious. William James Anderson, using his significant investments and corporate interests, would have been closely monitoring market circumstances. September. The 21st of 1929 fell on a Saturday. As usual, William was at his refinery that day, did on the weekends when he had to attend to business. Throughout the day, he met with a number of business associates, talking about operations and contracts. Several workers observed him moving, conducting meetings at his office on the 3rd level of the main building, touring the property, and examining operations. Construction. According to subsequent employee testimony, at approximately 6 p.m., William instructed his employees to spend the weekend at home. He mentioned that at 6:30 p.m., he had a private business meeting and desired the facility to be cleared. This was not out of the ordinary. Occasionally, William had private meetings to discuss delicate business issues. Robert was the on-duty security guard. Sullivan subsequently stated in court that he had observed the Williams Cadillac remaining parked at the refinery around approximately 7 o'clock p.m. Sullivan's rounds. The principal structure. William might still be inside because the lights were on. However, Sullivan checked. Once more, At approximately 9 p.m., the facility seemed deserted and the lights were off. Sullivan simply failed to let William know that he had left. Sunday passed. On September 23rd, Monday morning, William failed to show up for work. His secretary called the Anderson residence at the customary time. Anderson, Catherine, said that since her husband's departure for the refinery on Saturday morning, she had not seen him. She had thought he had stayed at the refinery working late and possibly spent the night at his conveniently maintained apartment there, but he had never spent the night without giving her a call. By Monday afternoon, the family and business partners were worried. By Monday night, the Gregg County. By Tuesday morning, the sheriff's investigation had revealed something was completely incorrect. William James Anderson, a prominent figure in East Texas. Strong males had disappeared completely. September 21st, 1929. The Anderson Refinery in East Texas on a Saturday afternoon. The establishment was operating with fewer employees and at a lower capacity throughout the weekend. William was located in the main refinery building, which included offices, a laboratory, and some processing equipment. During these weekend visits, James Anderson occupied the most of his time. Throughout, William was seen and conversed with by a number of staff members that Saturday. Margaret Wilson, the secretary, was working that morning to complete some letters. Later, she revealed, William had appeared distracted to investigators, but not in an unusual way. He would gotten multiple phone calls in the morning, and she had overheard portions of talks that seemed to be about business issues, perhaps disagreements, or some sort of discussion. At midday, one of William's drilling supervisors, Thomas Clark, visited with him to talk about the production rates for many wells. Anderson was in charge of operations. In later testimony, Clark stated that the gathering was routine, that William had been his typical demanding, meticulous, centered on increasing revenue. William's manner gave no indication that issues or worries. William and Daniel met at around 2 p.m. Martinez, a business partner with drilling equipment that Anderson's operation that is leased. They talked about the terms of the upcoming year's contract. Investigators were later informed by Martinez that William had struck a difficult deal as always, but the encounter had been friendly. Around 3 p.m., Martinez departed the facility, shaking hands with William in the lobby of the main building. From 3 to 6 p.m., a number of different William was observed by staff members going around the building. He examined a few processes, equipment, examined inventories in one of the storage spaces, then went back to his third-floor office to work on documentation. William left his workplace at around 5:45 p.m. and talked to a few of the IB's remaining staff members. He informed them that he was expecting a guest for a private business meeting and that they ought to spend the weekend at home. He expressed gratitude for their efforts and promised to meet them early on Monday. At 6:15 p.m., the refinery was. William and Robert Sullivan, the security guard, were the only people present. Sullivan's duty was to keep an eye on the land all night long, looking for any fires, illegal entry, or anything. Security concerns. After 5 years of employment with Anderson, he was familiar with the routine effectively. Sullivan later gave a thorough account of what happened that night. He was standing close to the main gate around 6:30 p.m. when he noticed a car pull into the property. It was getting darker, and Sullivan was unable to view the driver clearly or determine the sort of car. The car headed for the main structure and parked close to the door. Sullivan thought this was William's anticipated guest. He didn't look into it further. William had expressed his want for seclusion during their meeting. The Roundtree 700 p.m. Sullivan went about the property as usual. He passed the main building and observed that the basement and third-floor office space had lights on. This seems to be typical. The Williams Cadillac remained parked in its customary location. However, the other car he had saw arrive was still there. Later, Sullivan was only able to describe it as a dark, cold sedan. Sullivan carried on making his rounds, inspecting the different outbuildings and storage spaces. He came back around 8:30 p.m. to the area around the main structure. Now the lights were out. Williams. The visitor's car and the Cadillac had vanished. Sullivan believed the gathering had completed, and the two men had departed. However, this is where the chronology gets unclear and unsettling. Sullivan was unaware that Williams' Cadillac was still there. On Monday, the following day, it was discovered parked behind one of the storage buildings, out of sight from Sullivan's regular patrol route or the main gate. Williams' automobile was locked. The ignition still has the keys in it. On the back seat was his bag, which held business papers and a significant sum of money, roughly $2,000. William had taken money out of the bank on Friday. The inquiry into the disappearance of William James Anderson started as soon as it became apparent on Monday, September 23rd, that he hadn't just gone for the weekend. James Wilson, the sheriff, personally oversaw the examination in light of Williams' local notoriety. The refinery in Anderson was extensively searched. Each structure, each storage space, each component of equipment big enough to hide a person was inspected. Williams was discovered by investigators on the third level of the main building, appearing to be unharmed. His workstation included letters, financial documents, and business paperwork. Nothing seemed absent or out of place. After searching the main building's basement, detectives discovered only what they anticipated: utility equipment, storage rooms, and vacant places utilized for different industrial uses. The basement's lesser size compared to the architectural drawings went unnoticed. Indicated, it appeared as though the wall that had been constructed to block off a portion of the basement had always existed. There was no cause to suspect anything in the absence of blueprints for comparison. The layout of the basement is peculiar. Williams' Cadillac was discovered behind a storage facility, was thoroughly inspected. No indications of difficulty, no blood, no signs of aggression. The vehicle was only parked and secured as though William had purposefully left it there. However, why put it behind the storage building rather than where he usually is? Furthermore, how had he parked it there? Departed the property of the refinery? The inquiry soon narrowed down to a few hypotheses. Abduction. Williams' wealth made kidnapping for ransom seem plausible. However, no ransom demand never came to pass. There was no communication for days, then weeks, from anyone asking money or claiming to be in possession of William. Not requiring a ransom demand, kidnapping didn't seem likely. Competitors in business. The oil sector was aggressive and competitive. Maybe a competitor in business had made the decision to get rid of William. However, who and how they would. Have you done it at Williams' own refinery? Investigators examined Williams's numerous business problems and disputes. A number of names surfaced as individuals who had grounds for animosity or even hatred for William. They were all looked into. Everyone claimed to have an alibi for September 21st. Not a single could be unquestionably linked to the disappearance. Voluntary disappearance. Maybe William had decided to vanish. However, why? His company was doing quite well. His family life was steady. He was respected, powerful, and wealthy. What would spur him on to leave everything behind? Some conjectured that he may have engaged in illicit operations and escaped to avoid prosecution, but there was no proof of such actions. Others proposed romantic relationships or covert financial issues, but once more, no. These theories were supported by evidence. The enigmatic guest the most. The guest Sullivan had saw arrive at around 6:30 was a fascinating clue. PM. Who was this individual? What kind of private meeting did William have? Had brought up? Sullivan's description was annoyingly ambiguous. A sedan that is dark. Could not describe the driver or identify the make or model. Investigators attempted to determine who William may have been in a meeting. They looked over his business letters, his appointment books, his phone logs. There was no scheduled meeting in any of his documents. Everyone who had visited the refinery on September 21st was interrogated as part of the investigation. Every verified the same basic chronology. All attested to William's request that they depart by 6 p.m. Nobody could figure out who he might be seeing. Margaret Wilson, his secretary, stated that she was not aware of any meetings scheduled for that evening. If William had set up a meeting on his own, without consulting his employees, weeks turned into months, and the research went on, but no new discoveries were made. Anderson, William James, had just disappeared. His family hoped he would be discovered alive, possibly experiencing amnesia or being detained against his will. However, as hope waned as months stretched into years. October of 1929. The Great Depression began when the stock market plummeted just 1 month after Williams vanished. The ensuing economic disaster captured the public's attention. Williams, even though it was still talked about locally, the national crisis overshadowed the disappearance as simply another unexplained mystery. The Anderson refinery kept running. William Anderson's wife, Catherine Anderson, took nominal control with the assistance of their 26-year-old son James, and knowledgeable about the industry. The refinery made it through the Great Depression and remained in operation during the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. However, without Williams's entrepreneurial spirit and commercial ability progressively diminished. 1936. William James Anderson was officially pronounced dead 7 years after he vanished. This made it possible for his estate to settle, allowing his family to proceed. He divided his wealth with his spouse and kids. The refinery was run by a family, although it would never attain the heights it had attained under Williams' direction. In the 1970s, the Anderson refinery was no longer profitable. More expansive, contemporary facilities had made it is out of date. The refinery shut down in 1976. The apparatus was sold or thrown away. The land was too contaminated, allowed to deteriorate, and difficult to redevelop with ease. Additionally, behind a September-built brick wall in the main building's basement. In 1929, William James Anderson's remains were unknown for almost a century. To share their tale, the 94 years that separated William James Anderson's. His remains were found in 2023 after going missing in 1929. Changes that a person living during the 1920s oil boom could not have predicted. The space age, the civil rights movement, World War II, the Great Depression, the internet, and the computer revolution. The entire universe shifted while beneath his own refinery, Williams' remains were concealed. The family of Audrey Anderson persisted. Over the years, William's wife, Catherine Anderson, lived until 1958 before passing away. At the age of 79, unaware of her husband's fate, she had invested. Having been widowed for almost 30 years, I've never been able to locate the answers. James. Up until his passing in 1973, Anderson, their eldest son, oversaw the remaining family business ventures. The other children, Elizabeth and Thomas, eventually left Texas, although they kept some link to the region. By 2023, the Anderson family's close relationship with most of East Texas had vanished. The offspring, great-grandchildren, and William and Catherine's great-great-grandchildren were dispersed throughout the nation. Many were unaware of the complete tale of their forefathers' unexplained departure. It had turned into family history, an intriguing comment regarding the great-grandfather of an oil baron who disappeared in 1929. The shuttered Anderson refinery became into a landmark in the area, but not in any favorable sense. The location was gated off, abandoned for decades, and marked with alerts on structural risks and pollutants. Every now and then, teenagers entered to investigate the ruins, but most people thought it was more depressing than thrilling. The enormous tanks and equipment for processing rusted away. Structures crumbled or remained in progressively hazardous states of disrepair. The land was gradually returned to nature, with flora sprouting through the concrete and around metal that is rusting. Over the years, numerous businesses and developers thought about buying the land for redevelopment, but the necessary environmental cleanup was costly, and the property was less appealing because of its past. Several times during the 1990s, 2000s, the building was acquired by new owners with ambitious ambitions that never came to pass. Every now and again, the mystery surrounding William James Anderson's disappearance reappeared in historical significance in the area. During the 1980s, a local historian penned an article with a part on William's disappearance about notable East Texans who had met strange endings. The essay analyzed the different explanations, summarized the known information, and came to the conclusion that we would probably never find out the truth. A Real Crime podcast conducted an episode on the Williams case, looking at it as part of a series on early 20th century unsolved disappearances. The program discussed the information, spoke with historians and descendants of those who participated in the initial inquiry, and they conjectured about several possibilities. However, for 8 decades, conventional research techniques yielded no new findings. November of 2022, the Anderson Refinery land was acquired by Lanier Development Corporation at auction. Cleaning and rebuilding of industrial sites was the company's area of expertise. They perceived promise in the 40 acres of land that was becoming more and more desirable as the Tyler region kept expanding. They had a simple plan: destroy the deserted structures securely, clean up any pollution in the surroundings, and rehabilitate the area for business or mixed-use applications. Planning for the demolition started in early 2023. This necessitated thorough examinations of every building and environmental risks, and creating a demolition plan that would keep workers safe and reduce the influence on the environment. The structural engineer, Robert Martinez, recruited to supervise the demolition planning, took a thorough approach to the project. March 14, 2023, Robert Martinez and his group were doing the last thorough inspection of the main refinery structure prior to demolition. The brick 3-story structure. The structure would be the most difficult to safely demolish because it was the biggest building on the land. Robert had acquired copies of the county's original 1925 architectural plans documents. He was noting modifications as he compared the designs to the actual construction, degradation, and possible risks. In the basement, he observed the disparity. The drawings depicted a sizable open area that was roughly 50 feet by 30 feet. However, Robert's measurements in the basement revealed that it was only roughly 30 feet. 20 feet of the basement's original length had been lost by 30 feet. "There's a wall here that shouldn't be," Robert told Jennifer Hayes, his assistant, as they stood in the basement, looking at the eastern wall. "This basement is shown in the blueprints, extending an additional 20 feet east. A section was sealed off," Jennifer said. "The brickwork doesn't match the rest of the basement," she said, looking closely at the wall. "Look at the mortar color and the pattern of laying. There is little doubt that this wall was erected later." Robert took pictures of the wall and recorded the disparity. His expertise informed him that before demolition, this needed to be looked into. If there were structural problems, environmental risks, or utilities concealed behind the wall, the demolition crew had to be aware of them. He made contact with Lanier Development's project manager and suggested that the sealed area be opened prior to destruction. The management concurred, giving Robert permission to cautiously penetrate the wall in order to investigate what was behind it. Robert's crew started gently removing bricks from the wall's core on March 15th. The job was sluggish and methodical, paying close attention to structural stability at all times. By late, they had made a hole big enough to see through in the morning. Robert directed his spotlight into the shadows outside. The beam illuminated a space that had been totally sealed for many years. The stale air that leaked out was thick with the odor of rot and mold. The flashlight beam revealed a brick and concrete floor, walls, a low ceiling with exposed conduits and pipes, and in the distant corner, what seemed like a heap of trash or abandoned items. With caution, Robert stepped into the closed door, his illumination piercing the gloom. As he got closer, the heap of rubble in the corner turned out to be something much more important: skeletal remains of humans, laying on the ground, partially obscured by the remains of ruined garments. Robert contacted the police and retreated from the room right away. The Within an hour, the Gregg County Sheriff's Department arrived. By the afternoon, as a possible crime scene, the location was guarded. By nightfall, a thorough forensic team had shown up. It took many days for the sealed chamber to be examined forensically. The remains of the skeleton were meticulously recorded in situ before to removal. The body's position indicated that the individual had either been put in the room or had passed away there and fell to the ground. The majority of the remains were complete, though some smaller. Bones were strewn about. After 94, the clothes had substantially degraded. Years, but remnants of early 20th century men's buttons, a belt buckle, professional clothes, and leftover leather shoes. The substances in fashion were in line with 1920s or 1930s apparel. Many individual things had fared better than the leather and fabric. A gold pocket watch, with less rusting because of the enclosed, comparatively dry atmosphere. When, after the case was thoroughly cleaned, the engraving was visible. WJ in the year 1905. A gold signate ring with the initials A integrated into a family crest. The main layout. The severely broken remnants of a wallet. The leather nearly completely ruined, with only corroded metal clasps. Any type of paper. Over 94 years, the contents had totally collapsed. The forensic analysis of the skeletal remains supplied important details. The person was a man, roughly 50 to 55 years old when they passed away. Height is believed to be roughly 6 feet 2 inches. Significant trauma was evident in the skull. Right-sided fractures, consistent with 2 or more severe impact from a blunt item. This trauma would have been lethal right away or very close to it. There were no additional serious injuries that would indicate the head trauma was the cause of death. Historical investigation started right away. The location and the pocket watch's initials, WJA, prompted researchers to look through Anderson Refinery documents. The relationship to it was clear that William James Anderson was involved. Comparing the 1929 missing, the possibility was confirmed by the individual case. William James Anderson was absent for 94 years. 1929 dental records were found using persistent historical investigation. In the 1920s, a well-known dentist in Tyler provided dental care to William Anderson. The practice records of the dentist were still available because they had been archived. A comparison with the skeletal remains revealed a number of distinguishing characteristics that matched, offering solid supporting proof of the identification. For conclusive verification, DNA analysis was done. William James Anderson's descendants were found and contacted. A number of them consented to supply DNA samples. Genetic comparison of the conclusive identification was obtained by comparing skeletal remains to samples from known descendants. William James Anderson's remains were found there. The construction of the sealed room was also investigated. There was indications that the wall that had hidden the room was constructed in the late 1920s or early 1930s, which is in line with William's missing era. The cement and brickwork matched the materials that would have been utilized back then. That wall was constructed expressly to conceal the room and its occupants, sealed it so well that it remained uncovered for almost a century. William James Anderson's remains were found 94 years after he vanished. Raised numerous questions regarding who killed him and why, while providing an answer to the question of what happened to him. The amount of information that forensic evidence could provide about the events was incredibly restricted after almost a century of his killing and hiding. The majority of the following is well-informed conjecture supported by scant evidence, historical documents, and logical deductions rather than verifiable facts. What? Physical evidence allowed investigators to conclude that William James Anderson passed away on or very soon after September 21st, 1929. There was no proof in the skeletal remains of living past that time frame. He died away from blunt force injuries to the skull, at least 2 severe head injuries that would have been lethal right away. He was murdered, and his remains were deposited in a portion of the refinery basement that was later covered with a masonry wall to serve as his grave. The The skeletal findings made the cause of death evident. Clearly, the cause of death was homicide. After 94 years, it was still unclear who killed the victim and why. Complete assurance regarding the identity of the murderer after over a century was not feasible. Everybody in the refinery on September 21st, 1929, was deceased for a long time. There wasn't much physical evidence other than the skeletal remains, however. To create the most likely answer, investigators and forensic historians looked at the evidence that was available. The likely scenario was indicated by a number of criteria. The crime took place in a subterranean location of Williams' own refinery. That was not available to the general public. The AD assassin needed to be able to access the facility and familiarity with the layout of the basement. The wall's construction, too. It took time, supplies, and experience to seal the space. If someone didn't have a good purpose to labor in the field, they couldn't have done this swiftly or covertly. Construction. The timing was important. Williams sent all of his staff members home on the night of September 21st, claiming to have a private meeting planned. Around 6:30 p.m., a security guard noticed a car come. Researchers hypothesize that William was murdered either during or soon after that encounter. Williams' guest that night is thought to be the most likely culprit, yet even after 94 years, this still conjecture as opposed to verifiable truth. The design of the sealed room would have needed to put in a number of hours of effort, possibly into Sunday or Monday. Whoever constructed that wall required access to building supplies, the refinery, and sufficient time to finish the task uninterrupted. This implied that either a worker at the refinery or someone who has the right to be there without being questioned. William James Anderson was the most plausible theory given the evidence at hand and the historical background. Most likely, someone he knew and trusted enough to meet in private killed him. Investigators surmise that the September 21st encounter was probably about business, whether a transaction, a disagreement, or a discussion. Something went wrong during that meeting. Disastrously incorrect. According to the skeletal evidence, William passed away at least 2 hits to the head from a blunt item like a tool or device, accessible in an industrial setting, but it is impossible to pinpoint the precise circumstances that led to the violence. 94 years later, what transpired following Williams' passing is still mostly conjecture. A wall was constructed to cover the body, which was hidden in a part of the basement. The area. It would have taken several hours of labor and access to building supplies. The perpetrator was either able to work or had authorized access to the refinery. Unnoticed over the weekend. The wall's construction indicates some degree of design, or at the very least speed, thinking under duress, but it is impossible to pinpoint the precise order of events or the killer's mental process. Rebuild with assurance. In particular, who was the murderer? A number of suspects could fall into many categories. A competitor in business who had set up the encounter in order to bargain or intimidate William, subsequently killed him during a heated altercation. An employee of the refinery who had access to and familiarity with the layout of the facility. A worker with construction expertise who may have constructed the wall. A business partner or partner who needed to get rid of William because he had engaged in dubious activities with him. The enigmatic. Around 6:30 p.m., the security guard noticed a guest come, but was unable to explain. In specifics, it was hard to identify the exact person after 94 years. Everyone concerned had passed away. Documents that could have offered hints were destroyed. Decades ago, the entire truth was buried with the murderer. William's murder took place a few weeks prior to the October 1929 stock. An element of historical irony was added by the market catastrophe. Some conjectured that William may have known about the impending financial catastrophe, and the murder may have been connected to attempts to secure assets or influence markets prior to the catastrophe. However, there is no proof. Encouraged such conjecture. The descendants of William James Anderson felt some closure after the discovery. Growing up, his great-great-grandchildren were familiar with the family tradition about the oil baron grandfather who inexplicably disappeared and at last knew what had happened to him, if not why or by whom. William James Anderson's remains were given to his family in April 2023. On April 30th, he was laid to rest in a spot adjacent to Catherine in a Tyler cemetery. His wife, Anderson, passed away in 1958. The gravestone recognized his existence and the enigma that had been resolved at last. Anderson, William James, 1877-2. After being misplaced for 94 years, it was finally buried in 1929. Following the completion of the forensic investigation, the destruction of the Anderson Refinery property went ahead as scheduled. The abandoned buildings were being destroyed in the summer of 2023. The location where William's body, which had been concealed for almost a century, was only another piece of brick and concrete that had been reduced to rubble. Dragged off, the property was cleared by the end of 2023 and prepared for the following phase. Throughout its past, what actually became of William James Anderson then? Considering skeletal evidence, we are aware that he either died quickly or from blunt force injuries to the head. Following September 21st, 1929, we are aware that his body was concealed in a sealed area in the basement of his own refinery. We are aware that the concealment worked, sufficient to remain unnoticed for 94 years. However, the crucial queries: who killed him? What specifically transpired at that last meeting? Why did the violence occur? These continue to be conjectural, based on logical inference and circumstantial evidence. Almost a century later, with the majority of the tangible evidence was destroyed or decayed, and everyone involved was long dead, it is impossible to know these specifics for sure. William James's tale. Anderson reminds us that power and wealth don't shield us from violence, that crimes can be concealed through deft concealment for generations, that chance and technology can eventually uncover secrets that appear to be lost forever, that historical, even after almost a century, mysteries can occasionally be partially solved, and that lives may be lost as well as profits in the cutthroat, even violent world of the oil boom era could come to an abrupt end, with truth becoming yet another victim of ambition and avarice. William James Anderson, may you rest in peace. Your kingdom fell apart, your wealth was transferred to others, but your tale has now been told, although incompletely. You've been located and buried properly after 94 years. The queries. At least you're no longer concealed in the shadows beneath the refinery you constructed, even though the question may never be completely resolved.